if you have a gut feeling about something, then you report it without a doubt. You know what I mean? I always say to people, it doesn't matter how silly it feels to you. If it doesn't sit right with you, you report it in. Let us make that decision.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of About Safeguarding Podcast. And today we're joined with Anne Marie. Good morning, Anne Marie.
Good morning.
Would you like to tell everybody what your role is and introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, so morning everyone, I'm Anne Marie McAteer and I'm a Detective Constable currently with Kent Police. I've served with Kent Police for about 30 years, mainly in child protection. So probably about 20 years of that has been working in safeguarding and child protection. And I'm currently a trainer, so I currently train detectives coming through the system.
This is why we asked you to speak with us today, because you do a lot of training with the police and social services, don't you? You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention social services, didn't I? So about 2 years ago, I went over to training school, having done my master's in child protection, to train our detectives that are coming in around child protection, because they, you know, in the basic training they get some training, but it's very, very basic. So what will happen is our detectives who go into child protection will come on a week's course, and that week's course is run alongside social workers now. We used to do it many years ago, and then unfortunately, COVID and financial reasons, it kind of split, and it was just police officers. So when I went to training school about 2 years ago, I kind of fought to get it back to social services and the police being working together, because I remembered the value that I got from it when I was a young DC, you know, and getting in a room with those social workers and just having no pressure to discuss all the things that kind of maybe gripe against each other is really invaluable. So we do a week's training, and it's called a SCIDIP, which stands for Specialist Child Investigator Development Programme. And there should be a portfolio at the end of that makes them a national child protection investigator. The portfolio is a bit of a sticking thing at the moment, because like everyone, we're short-staffed and we don't get a chance to do it. But the hope is at the end of that week, officers come out with a much better understanding of working together, Section 47s, Section 17s, female genital mutilation, fabricated induced illness, you know, several other things that maybe they don't get the time to get in their basic training. And the big thing I think they take away from it is they get that time with social workers to kind of iron out the differences between the two organisations who work really close together, you know. So I think the main feedback is that they get that chance to kind of get to know each other's roles and have a better understanding. So yes, it's quite good. And within that course, sorry, just to say, within that course, we have a health input. So we have a doctor who comes in and gives an input from health. We've got a nurse, a safeguarding nurse, who also gives an input around child development. So, you know, we try to kind of get as much as we can into that week for them learning.
That's a lot to pack in 1 week.
Yes, yeah. Unfortunately, I would ideally like to, but time constraints and what have you. You know, officers don't always get the time to take that length of course on. But a week, you know, in a week, it is very packed. It's very heavy. But I do think officers get a lot out of it, because we get officers that come into child protection not even knowing what a child protection incident is. You know, a Section 47, because they don't. Section 47 isn't written in criminal law. You know, it's under the working together agreement. So to give you an example, I had this lovely officer who was very enthusiastic. He'd just come out of uniform and he's on this course, and, you know, really enthusiastic, really wants to do the job. And I kind of said to them, I said, can anyone tell me what a Section 17 is? And he puts his hand up and he's really eager to answer it. And I kind of said, yeah, what is it? And he went, that's when we can kick the door in to save life and limb. Because in police law, in criminal law, we have a Section 17, which is where we can put the door in if we believe that someone is in danger. So he was quite right, but he wasn't right in the context that we were talking about. So that's where, you know, it's really key for officers to know those kind of things. We have in the last year started teaching uniformed officers, so they do get a day's input around child protection, and it is only a day, but again, it lets them know what Section 47 is, Section 17 is. It gives them an overview of how limited social services are, which I think is really important, because I think sometimes a lot of police officers tend to think that social workers don't do anything. Because they don't have the power to get into houses and take children out. They don't have the police protection powers that we have. So I think officers need to know that it's not a case of the social workers not doing anything. It's a case of they're very limited to what they can do. And the hope is that that will make the officers a little bit more useful and a little bit more helpful when they're out there at the sharp end.
Yeah. And just to explain to those who don't know what Section 47 and Section 17 is, could you explain what it is, please?
Yeah, so when we get a referral on a child, so say a school phones up and says, you know, we're really worried about this child. He said he doesn't want to go home for physical reasons or whatever. That will come in and it will go into what's called a strategy discussion, which is where every professional who's involved with that child, as much as they can be, get round. I say round the table, it's now obviously a virtual table, but you may have police, you'll have social services, definitely, you'll definitely have health, and you may at times have school or the GP or, you know, someone who's involved with the family and knows the family quite well. That concern is then discussed along with a history that's held, and a decision is made as to whether it hits the threshold for a Section 47, which is where we believe that that child may be at significant risk of harm, or is it a Section 17, which is kind of also known as a child in need. So that's where that family may need support and help, but not necessarily the same level as you have in a Section 47. Now, Section 47 is quite powerful for us as professionals, because that will lead to a joint visit with the police and social services immediately. So if we need to go out to the school or the home address, that's where we'll go. And it also gives us that power to speak to a child without consent. Now, that comes with a bit of caution because obviously best practice is always to have consent and have the parents on board. But you can imagine if we are looking at parents maybe physically chastising a child, parental consent at that point is not really going to work. So, you know, it's really important that we get out there and speak to that child in a safe environment, to find out what's going on, you know, and see what action we then take. Once we do that joint visit, it kind of splits a little bit under Section 47. So the police will deal with the criminal aspect, any interviews, any arrests that need to be done, and social services will then undertake their assessment. But it's really important that as two organisations, we work as one. You know, and what I try to stress to the officers is whilst our priorities may change at that point, we still need to be communicating. You know, we still need to be advising the social worker what we're doing with that parent that might be sitting in custody, you know, bail conditions, that kind of thing, so that they can then work with that family. You know, and it's getting across the fact that we can kind of go in a bit heavy-handed. And I say heavy-handed, I don't mean, you know, physically, but we can go in a little bit. We've got the power behind us to go in and arrest people and things like that. What I try to say to the officers is they've got to remember that the social worker has to continue that relationship. So whilst we kind of go in and do our hit, if you like, the social worker needs to then try and get things to an even keel with the family. So it's extremely it's extremely powerful. The other thing we can do under 47 is we can exchange information without consent. So social services or health can then tell us what they hold on file. And likewise, we can tell them what we hold on file. So the information sharing is a lot quicker. Whereas under a Section 17, parental consent is needed. So before social services could do any checks on those parents under Section 17, they would have to get written consent for that. Obviously, if they can't get written consent, then that may heighten the concerns enough to bring it back to Section 47. But Section 47 for us is quite a powerful, and it shouldn't be taken lightly, you know, because with it comes a lot of responsibility.
Yeah. Thank you for explaining that. So you spoke about how the police officers have training with social workers and how you have to work together and things like that. Do they have any training around how to work with educational settings?
So we don't, unfortunately. In an ideal world, I think we would have everyone in the same room, but that's never a possibility. We do some training around Open Compass. So, and I'm not sure if this just sits in Kent where I work, but Open Compass was set up many years ago where we'd have a domestic abuse situation and the child would go into school the next morning and the teacher would have no idea why that child was falling asleep at their desk. So Open Compass came around and we now inform the school when we get anything like that in, which I think is a great thing because then the school know the signs to look out for. So officers do get taught about that. They do get a slight input about designated safeguarding leads so they know who they should speak to and what they should exchange. But unfortunately, from an actual education point of view, there isn't anything that sits. We have a social worker that comes in and talks about social services, sort of the out of hours system and things like that. So we have professionals who will touch on what the education system do with safeguarding. But unfortunately, we don't have any safeguarding from the school point of view as such, which I think is a real shame because that's where we usually go into.
But that's usually where the children are, spend most of their days, isn't it?
Yeah,
That's usually
and
where
that's
they,
usually who knows the children best.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you know, we do throughout our training, we do try to feed in the importance of speaking to schools and communicating. And I try to feed in the importance of, I think as a police service, we've got very precious about GDPR. So we get very, very worried, you know, because whenever it's breached, it hits the news. And, you know, so officers get very worried. And what we try to stress to them is where safeguarding's concerned, if you've got a safeguarding concern, GDPR doesn't, you know, it doesn't come into it. There is not a problem with sharing that information with a teacher or whatever at school, as long as it's rational information. So, you know, I think we're getting better. We're definitely getting better. You know, we didn't have open compass in any, you know, I can remember a time where the schools just didn't know about things, you know, so social services and the police would know everything, but the schools would be like, I've had no idea, no idea that this child is even touching the services until it gets to that child protection stage, you know, where either we're going into the school or there's a child protection conference called. So I think we're getting better, but I think like everything, we've probably got a bit of a way to go yet.
With everybody, I think with every service, we're still
Yeah.
moving forward, aren't they? So
Yeah.
So again, going back to the training, because I find it very fascinating. So, you know, is there training given to the police about how to interview children, how to communicate with children? What does that look like?
Yeah, so uniformed officers, again, get very limited. We went through a phase of uniformed officers being very frightened to speak to children. So we quite often get them phoning up the child protection team and saying, I've got a child here and I don't know how to speak to them, you know, and we'd have to kind of say to them, speak to them like you would any other human being. So we've tried to kind of bring that home to them. And now in domestic abuse situations, they do, it's mandatory now that we, you know, if a child is in bed, when a domestic abuse incident happens, we waken that child up. Which in the beginning I kind of struggled with that a little bit, but then you go over to the view of that child might not actually be sleeping. That child might actually be lying in bed absolutely terrified about what's going on downstairs. So officers are much better at that, and they do get in their CPD, they get an input on that. So they get an input around turning their radios off when they get to speak to a child, maybe taking their tie off or their hat off to just soften the uniform that they're wearing, or even just explaining, you know, look, I've got a uniform on, but don't worry about that. That doesn't mean anything. I'm here to keep you safe. So they do get training around how to kind of settle that child. When it comes to interviewing, uniformed officers will very rarely touch on that because it is quite a specialist skill. So when there's a sign, when a child makes an allegation, kind of all the questioning will stop, and then a child protection officer will be brought in. Now, child protection officers are trained under the Achieving Best Evidence guidance to do visual recorded interviews, quite specialist interviews. And that's been extended now to DA officers, so domestic abuse officers are trained to do that as well. So it's not just child protection, but they are trained, so they're given a week's training course around interviewing. Unfortunately, years ago, that used to be a joint course with social services. So you would do your Sky Dip and then you would do the AB. Unfortunately, that's kind of gone. You know, we've tried to bring it back, but it's just not happening at the moment. But officers will get a week's training around interviewing children and vulnerable witnesses. Now, when I say children, it's very, very light on children. It's mainly around that vulnerable witness. So your vulnerable adult or your vulnerable, you know, young person. Once they've done that, they can then go out and they can interview mainly around minor offences.
Yeah.
Okay, I wouldn't be asking an officer who's just done a week's course on that to then go out and investigate a child who's just been raped, you know, because that's just too much for them. But what we've now adopted in Kent, we've gone back to a system where we've got a 2-week course that runs after that. So once you've kind of acclimatized yourself to ABs and you can submit one that's quite reasonable, you can then get yourself put on a 2-week course, which is quite intense again because it's 2 weeks. But with that, they get someone who comes in and speaks to them about trauma.
Yeah.
So we've got a specialist who comes in and actually focuses on trauma-informed practices, which I think is really important because I think in the police we're very quick at, oh, something's happened, let's interview you. We don't think
Yeah.
about the window tolerance or where they're at that time. So again, it's trying to say to the officers, you need to think, is that person, is it the right time to interview that person? Or do you need to give them some sleep before you interview them? Especially children. They get an input from an educational psychologist, which is really handy for them. They get an input from an intermediary, a registered intermediary, about how they communicate with children and how they assess a child, which I think really kind of gives officers a lot of tips. And they get an input from an officer around autism and learning difficulties. So on top of all those inputs, they also have to do some role plays. So they have to interview. And those role plays are really complex. So one of those role plays will literally be a scenario where you have a domestic abuse incident where a father has stabbed a mother in the kitchen, a child has walked in and witnessed it. So you've got a child witness, you've got mum who's obviously a vulnerable witness, you've got the old lady across the road who's heard the commotion and seen him running from the property. So you've got your significant witness that's vulnerable as well. So that plays out through the day. So they get a chance to interview all different types of witnesses. On the Friday, they then get given a case file with statements and things like that, and they have to go in and interview someone who's either experienced a child rape or an adult that's experienced a rape, so kind of real severe case. And what we expect from them then is all the planning around it. What their considerations are going to be, how they're going to make it easier for that person to be interviewed, and they then get assessed on that. So it's quite an intense 2-week course, and you have to be at a certain level to get that. But that's kind of what we expect from our child protection officers, really, because they're the ones that are dealing with, and communicating with children, especially in an interview setting, is really tough. It's a really tough place for a child to be, because unfortunately police stations aren't the friendliest places, and it doesn't matter how much we try to make those rooms more comfortable, they're still very sterile.
Yeah.
And there's distractions at a police station. So, if you're interviewing, I remember interviewing like a 3 and 4 year old, and you've got the police cars sitting there, and they're much more interested in the police cars than they are in speaking to the officer. But also, people can talk to you in a room, but once they get into that interview setting and that recording starts, they can totally shut down. So the officers have to be able to really work at bringing that person round, and building that rapport and things like that. So it is really intense. We need to be better at it. Unfortunately, we're not very good at it. And I think, again, that goes back to, we kind of train officers and we expect them to run with it without any kind of refresher training, just due to lack of resources. So I was doing some training locally yesterday for officers because they really want to do well. We've got a lot of officers out there that really want to do the right thing, but really struggle and really find it tough. So, and I think the secondary trauma sometimes that they can take from it as well, because if they're interviewing children about really bad things day in, day out, the welfare side for them can be really extreme. But yeah, so that's the interviewing, and they obviously get suspect interviewing as well. So they'll have some interviewing skills from interviewing suspects, but that is slightly different because there's a lot more law legislation around that. And what I mean by that is we've got a thing called PACE, which is the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which kind of puts down the guidelines of how long we can interview someone, how long we can keep them in custody, what kind of rights they have in an interview, where else with an ABE interview, a witness interview, you don't have that kind of stringent guideline. So I think officers are much better when they're told you must do this, 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 and this. When they're kind of told they need to work it themselves, it becomes a little bit more stressful.
And linking to the PACE, there's a whole section in there about appropriate adults, isn't there?
Yeah.
And when it comes to schools, they're now telling schools they've got to have appropriate adults in place when children are talking to the police and stuff. So could you tell us more about the appropriate adult when it comes to children?
Yeah. So appropriate adults in the police is very much a child in custody thing, and we are trying to get away from having children in custody. I've seen a real big movement over the last 30 years. I mean, I unfortunately can remember those children who would play up at home. 14-year-old would play up at home, end up being arrested, be put in a holding cell for the night. And when I say a holding cell, it would be a clear, transparent door, or the door would be left open and an officer would be sitting with them all the time. We've really gone away from that now. We acknowledge that custody is not a place where a child should be, but there is the odd occasion where you might get a young teenager in custody because there's just nowhere else, and depending on the crime they've committed. So we have an appropriate adult scheme, which I believe is run by social services. And it's very much we phone up, we register for an appropriate adult in the hope that we'll get one. Now, it's a really scarce scheme. And I say that because it's a volunteer scheme. So it's just people who want to give back to society, and all credit to them. I've seen appropriate adults sitting in custody for up to 14 hours. Because they just want to do the right thing by people and they're in there kind of trying to protect them. So we sometimes can't get one. And that causes a bit of a headache if there just is no one available. We then have to make that decision about whether we bail. And what I mean by bail is that we can release someone from custody with a set time limit for them to return. So, and sometimes there can be conditions on that. So one of those conditions might be to go and live with a family member and not to contact the home. That's a really tough one, because we need to be careful with how we use bail. Or we can look at getting a family member in, or someone responsible. So back in the day, we did use teachers a couple of times, and we did use social workers. That tends to be a bit more scarce now, and I don't think that's a bad thing, because I think that can kind of blur the lines of where teachers stand, if you know what I mean. But now and again, we will get maybe a social worker who's worked with a child that will say, look, I'll come in and act as an appropriate adult. But more often than not, we'd look at a family member, and preferably a family member that wasn't involved. So if it's an incident that's happened at home with mum and dad, is there an older brother or sister, over the age of 18? Is there a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle that can come in? Because obviously if we can do that, we can interview faster and we can move the process along. Now, appropriate adults are there just to make sure that we deal with a child or a young person in the right way. So they're there to make sure that they're given the rights, because people have certain rights when they come into custody, to let someone know that they've been arrested, to look at the codes of practice, which governs how we deal with them, to get free independent legal advice. That's another one. So they're there to make sure that those rights are given and that those rights are understood. So does that young person understand that they might be saying at that moment in time, I don't want a solicitor, but actually they can ask for a solicitor at any point. So it's really important that they know that. They're also there to make sure that the officer deals with them in an ethical way. So, so that there's no banging in the table and you will tell me and all that kind of stuff that you might see in movies. And also there to, if that child's really struggling with the questions that are being asked, then they can't answer the questions for that child. And that can be really difficult when it's a family member, because, as a family member, your ultimate protection is to answer for them. So that can be really tough, because sometimes we have to kind of almost tell them off for that. But it's there for them to say, look, they don't understand that. They don't get it. So you're going to have to rephrase it, or you're going to have to say it in a different way. We can, just as an off point, people in custody are entitled to intermediaries. It doesn't get used very often because it's very much a solicitor-based thing. So if a solicitor feels that that young person needs an intermediary, they can obtain an intermediary, but the solicitor has to obtain it and pay for it. And obviously when someone's in custody, we've got a limited time of dealing with them. So obviously that time ticks away. But I think we're starting to see intermediaries being used more in courts with young people. So we're starting to see a lot more young people having an intermediary present during court proceedings. So I wouldn't be surprised if at some point that is revisited with the custody procedures as something that may replace an appropriate adult as time goes on. But yeah, the appropriate adult is very much there for a welfare point of view, and very important. Now, out of custody, we can use appropriate adults in interviews. They don't tend to be called appropriate adults because it will tend to be a family member. We don't tend to use the scheme for that unless you've got a child who really doesn't have anyone. Then we would maybe resort to asking an appropriate adult to come in then, but that is very much a custody procedure. If it's in an AB, then we would look at a family member, but again, a family member that's not a witness in the case. So it would have to be someone who we're not looking to take a statement from at a later date. Sometimes that can be the social worker. So more often than not, social workers will, if they've been working with a family, they may volunteer to come in as that appropriate adult. And just be there to make sure that we're questioning that child properly. But as I said, I think in interviews, in ABEs now, we use intermediaries a lot. And intermediaries are obviously there to assist the communication. So it kind of takes away the need for that appropriate adult as such.
So if I give you a scenario, say the police sometimes do come into schools and will sometimes interview children at schools.
Yeah.
So at that point, if they can't get hold of a family member, could a teacher step in at that point if the child wants that person?
Yeah. So we don't necessarily, we shouldn't be conducting interviews. If we're going to start interviewing someone, that should be under the AB, so it should be at a station or with a video portable kit. But what we will do is when we come in the joint visits, it is kind of like an interview because we're asking those initial questions. Now, what officers and social workers should do is the minute that child is disclosed an offence, we should be stopping it there for an interview. But obviously that joint visit initially will feel like an interview because you'll have a police officer and a social worker sitting there in front of you. So we always, or I always, and I always train my officers to do it, we always ask that child what they're more comfortable with. So sometimes children don't want teachers in the room, and we have to respect that. Sometimes children will say, actually, I'm quite comfortable speaking to you both in our own. What we do
Yeah.
is we make it quite clear to them that the teachers are there, and if they want to leave the room at any time, they can do. So, it's a case of making them feel safe.
Yeah.
But quite often, I've had children who have said, actually, I'd like my teaching assistant in with me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd like my teacher in with me. I'd like my head teacher in with me, and that's not a problem.
Yeah.
We don't have any issue with that at all. We shouldn't have any issue with that at all, because we've got nothing to hide. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes that can help. Sometimes that can help, because that reassurance of that teacher just sitting in the corner of the room, especially if they've got a good relationship, can be a real bonus for us.
Yeah.
But yeah, we would never, or we should never, not allow that. Now, I know when we look at the searches that have taken place, I can't comment on them too much because I wasn't involved, but even reading that myself as a police officer, my first thought is, where's the appropriate adult? Well, my first thought is they shouldn't be searching them in schools, but my first thought is, even if they are going to do that, where's that appropriate adult? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So searching is a whole different ball game to
Yeah.
going in and asking a few questions. But
Yeah.
definitely on a joint visit, I would have no issue. But it would have to be that child's view. I wouldn't take the
Yeah.
teacher's view over the child's view. I wouldn't have and I'm not saying I've never had a pushy teacher, but I wouldn't take a pushy teacher over
Yeah.
a child. If that child is
Yeah.
clearly saying, I don't want them in this room,
Mhm.
then they won't be there.
Yeah.
And again, family members, if that child says, I won't speak to you until my aunt is called, then
Yeah.
fine, we will call them.
Yeah.
Ideally, we don't want the person who's the suspect to the offence there, for obvious reasons. And that's why sometimes we get an issue with schools where the schools will automatically phone the parents up and
Yeah.
say, look, we've had to call the police. And I can understand why they do it, but I guess my appeal to them would be, let us do that.
Yeah.
Because when they do that and the parents turn up at school, the parents have then got a right to remove that child before we can speak to them. So the safeguarding gets a little bit tricky. So what we usually say to teachers is, can you wait until we get there and we will make that phone call? And good practice is to make that phone call before we walk into that room. I would definitely be phoning a parent and either leaving a message or saying to them, I'm now at your son's school. I'm going to speak to your son. You're welcome to turn up, because I can then manage that when they turn up. So yeah, that's why we can appeal to schools not to do that if they're referring it through to us as a high risk.
Yeah. So I think sometimes what happens with schools is they call social services to get advice, and the first thing that social services will say to them is, have you spoken to their parents?
Yeah.
That's the first thing they always say. So sometimes they may call social services for advice first, just to say, do you think we should call the police straight away? Do we think we should go down the MASH route, referral route and all this? And as a head, all the time they would only ever ask me, have I spoken to the parents? And if I say no, they tell me to go away and speak to the parents.
I know, and I think that goes back to that interagency, the working. But yeah, and I think the throwback to that has to be, look, the parents are suspected of causing this, so no, I'm not going to be speaking to them. And I think if you have an inkling that anything's going on at home, then you just put that referral in. And the referral goes in, and then, because we've seen it with Daniel Pelka, didn't we, where the school were seeing a lot of stuff, reporting it to the head teacher, who was a designated lead, who kind of wasn't raising it that high, and then look what happened. So I think I always say to people, go with your gut. If your gut is telling you that this could be, I can't send this child home because they may be at risk, then you need to be putting that referral in. Or call, if you have that contact at your child protection police station, you'll get a different response, I would imagine, from the police. It's just trying to get a hold of them. But, I think from a police point of view, we would probably be saying, put the referral in, don't phone the parents, and we'll look for it. But it's a tough one, isn't it? Because we're all up against it. And I remember
completely.
those 3 p.m. calls because the child's just disclosed before they're about to go home on a Friday.
Yeah.
And then every professional is like, it's Friday. We're trying to get out there before 3:30, before the parent turns up at the school. It's a really tough one. And for us, it's a really tough one when we have to go to the house and speak to them. So, where it's been a 3 o'clock call, we don't get out there till 5, and we have to go to the home address and speak to them. And I've had some horrendous jobs where I've been trying to speak to a child, and you can just tell that child's saying nothing in front of the parents, and the parents can be out of the room, but they're not going to say anything because they know dad's probably standing behind the door. And that's a real worry as well. So yeah, it's a tough one. I don't envy teachers on that one.
Well, I don't envy anybody really. They've all got their own the law, obviously, but their own rules they have to follow, and
I always think
strictly,
as police we're in a bit of a fortunate position though, because I think we
yeah,
do have that law behind us. We've got police protections and things like that
yeah,
we can use, which is a really big tool. And I know social workers that would love to be able to use police
yeah,
protections,
yeah,
make their life so much easier.
yeah, I
But
bet.
yeah.
Yeah, so that leads me on about to joint working. So do you want to tell us a bit about what joint working is? What does it look
Yeah.
like?
So joint working is really all about communication, and that's what I try to train my students in. It's about, not having that. No one professional will ever have an overview. And I know this is a cliche thing that we all say, but it's very true. No one professional will ever have an overview of a child's life or a young person's life. So if we don't communicate and share that information, we're never going to know. So I think joint working is just about having that good relationship. And I can remember a time back in the day when our units were a lot smaller where if I had something come in, I would pick the phone up and I would speak to a social worker that I knew, and I would
Yeah,
just say, can I run this job by you? Because I'm just not comfortable with it. We'd have a brief discussion, and more often than not, it'd be a case of, yeah, let's put a referral in and let's see where we go. Unfortunately, as things have got bigger, and I think as we've had more reports, that kind of relationship's broken down a little bit. It's coming back, but I think we're also pushed that we don't have that contact, that we can pick the phone up now and just answer the phone. Um, but I think, the whole thing about working together is not only communicating the information you've got about the family, but communicating what you're going to do. And if
yeah,
you're not going to do anything, communicating that as well. So quite a big complaint from us social workers quite often is that as the police, we run with a criminal investigation. We arrest mum or dad, and I'm referring to mum and dad here just as an example. There's loads of things I could choose, but we interview mum and dad in custody, we release them, and we don't update the social worker or the school. But who's the people that are going to be dealing with mum and dad on the Monday morning?
yeah,
So I think it's a case of that quick email, and there's no excuse now because we've so much ways of communicating, don't we, compared
yeah,
to the dark days when it was just the phone. But quick email, even if it's a quick email to say to everyone, mum and dad have been interviewed, they've been bailed to this date, these are the conditions, or they're not bailed, this is what's going to happen. So I really try to get across to them, it's about you explaining what you're going to do in your role as well. And I think good working together as well is that turning up at that visit and having that 5-minute discussion.
yeah,
You know what I mean? Because
yeah,
sometimes you turn up and you don't know the person you're walking into that room with. So it's
yeah,
that 5-minute discussion, even if it's in the car, and just saying to one another, look, right, who's going to ask the questions? Who's going to write the answers down? How are we going to approach this? How are we going to introduce ourselves? Are we going to go in full shirt and tie? Because, might be dressed up in a suit. Or are we going to kind of take the tie off and relax ourselves a bit for going in there? So I think, yeah, good working relationships are all about not just communicating about the person you're dealing with, but communicating about what you're doing as well.
yeah,
And if you can't do something, explaining why you can't do it.
yeah, yeah,
So I've been out on visits with social workers who have begged me to take a police protection, because they've got no other option. And they're like, please, will you, and I just can't. I just can't because it doesn't reach that threshold. And it's a case of explaining that rather than just saying no. So
yeah,
quite often I will say to them, look, I'd really like to help here, but actually I can't for these reasons.
yeah,
And
yeah,
explaining why, and I think the joint working that we're doing now in training helps because I think social workers have a better understanding of police protections. I think previously it was kind of like, well, the police can take them into police protection. Why are they not doing it? And we were sitting there thinking, well, social workers can go and get an emergency protection order. Why are they not doing it? So I think
yeah,
there's a better understanding, hopefully now. But again, it's just making sure that you've not misunderstood. So
yeah,
making sure that they understand why you're doing what you're doing, not just assuming that they know why you're doing what you're doing.
yeah,
So it's a really tough, because you're not just talking about the social worker here, you're talking about the teacher. You might even be talking about the health visitor. You're talking about
yeah,
everyone that's involved in that strategy discussion, being aware of what your plans are.
yeah,
And on a Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock, that can get quite tight. Um,
yeah,
but yeah,
yeah,
just even sending that email or, texts aren't the most professional way, but, if it's a text on a Friday night to say, look, this is what's happened so that you're aware of it on Monday morning, then it's got to be better than nothing. So,
absolutely.
yeah. So I don't know, I don't know if that kind of answers it, but yeah, I think it's about looking at
Yeah,
yourself as well as looking at the job that you're dealing with.
absolutely. I mean, it's cliche, but safeguarding is everybody's business and everybody has to do something. You can't just fob it off. I mean,
Yeah,
that's what we say to, people in schools, just because I'm a DSL doesn't mean you don't do anything. And it's the same for DSLs when they speak to social workers. We have to do something, and social workers have to do something, and the police have to do, and the health, etc., etc. We can't just all pass the buck.
And I think another thing I try to get across to them as well is if you are going to pass information on, do it properly. So, with our child protection referrals, we quite often get officers that will put about 6 lines. 6 lines is not going to tell anyone anything. And I know they're up against it and I know they're busy, but what we try to say to them is social services have to assess that job on those 6 lines. They're never going to be able to do that. So you need to be asking questions about what school they go to, who do they see at the weekend, even down to what kind of, we talk about contextual safeguarding, don't we? So, what kind of environment do they live in? Are we looking at a child that lives in quite a well-known rough estate, that I say rough, but a well-known estate that's known for maybe some gang activity and things like that, because that risk is going to be higher than your child that maybe goes to a private school and lives in a private gated housing estate, you know what I mean? So it's little things like that they don't think about. And it's the same with when they go in and do visits to the family home. We try to get them to think about looking around the whole house and not just because, how many houses do we go into that the living room is lovely, there's pictures up everywhere, and then that child has got nothing in their bedroom. So it's uncomfortable to turn around and say to a family member, because we've got no right to, but can I have a look around your house? But what I say to them is if the parents then say no, that should be setting your alarm bell off even further, so that should be up in your risk assessment, because you'd expect a parent to kind of go, yeah, it's a bit of a mess, but go ahead. So it's just getting them to think like that as well, because they are the first responders. So if they don't do that, and then we do it once we get that referral a week and a half later, that's a week and a half that's gone by. So it's when we talk about working together, actually it's not just working with different agencies, it's working within your own agency. And I think what's really important is that as child protection specialists, we need to be accessible to uniformed colleagues that don't have those skills, so that they can pick the phone up and say, look, I'm at this house. I mean, the amount of times I've had an officer phone up and go, I'm at this house and I've looked in the fridge and there's no food. And I've gone, right, if you check the freezer. Oh, no, I didn't think to check the freezer, but there's no fresh food. Right, check the freezer. They open the freezer and they go, oh, it's packed. Right, okay. Bedding's another one. Oh, they've got no quilt in their bed, right? But do they have any bedding on their bed at all? Oh, yeah, they've got a bed sheet and a couple of covers. Right, okay. That might be something that social services need to go in and work with the family on, but actually that's not a safeguarding. So it's about communicating it with your own, because I think what we need to realise is, especially in the police, we work in such a big organisation that no one knows everything. I would be really struggling to go out and do a traffic stop now and stop traffic, because I haven't done it for 20 odd years, you know what I mean? So I think it's not just about working together with other agencies, it's about working together in your own agency as well, and taking some responsibility.
So that leads nicely onto your top 3 non-negotiables for safeguarding. What would they be?
So I think my first one has to be, if you have a gut feeling about something, then you report it without a doubt. You know what I mean? I always say to people, it doesn't matter how silly it feels to you. If it doesn't sit right with you, you report it in. Let us make that decision. So that would probably be my first one. I think my second one is, and we use voice of the child quite regularly now, you know what I mean? But I think it's not just voice of the child, it's listening to what that child has to say. We can let that child give them their voice, but actually, are we hearing what they've got to say? Are we understanding it? So I think it's a case of how are you going to understand that child, and do you need to look at what age you need to understand that child? So, do you need an interpreter? Do you need an appropriate adult to be there? Do you need a teacher that maybe understands the learning difficulties more to explain to you what's going on? So I think, I'll use voice of the child as a crossover, but I think listening is really, and that's something I try to train them in interviews as well, because I'm not sure we always listen. I think we ask the questions, but we don't always hear what's being said back to us. Yeah, and I think the third thing would be just to try and recognise it, up your skills to recognise things. The little things that don't really amount to much, but do they form part of that? I always refer to a jigsaw, and I've done it for years, so it feels a little bit cliche. But does it add another link to that jigsaw? Does that little thing that you think is not really that important, does it then slide into that jigsaw where it kind of builds a bigger picture? And you can only do that by training yourself. And I think what I say to my officers is, we can sit here and moan about the organisation and what training they provide, because we all know that we never get enough training. I think any professional you speak to will say my employers never give me enough training. But actually, what do you do to go out there and find the training? You know, and if you're passionate about something, you will do that. You know, I had 20 years in child protection, kind of felt I'd got a bit stagnant, didn't know where to go. So I went and done my master's. At the time, it was probably the stupidest thing I could have done because COVID hit and what have you. But you know, for someone who'd sat there for 20 years, kind of feeling like I was quite rounded in what I was doing, actually there was a lot I didn't know, you know, and there was a lot I still had to learn. So I don't think you ever stop learning. So, and I think, you know, you need to take responsibilities for your own training as well. So whether that sits in safeguarding, I think it does, because safeguarding is so important. There's so much urgency around safeguarding, you know, because you only have that short window to kind of get it right and protect people. So yeah, I would say there's probably loads more I can think of, but off the top of my head, they're probably the three. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've got to agree with you with the learning. You're kind of thinking that you don't know enough. You will never know enough. And I must say, today during our podcast, I've learned a lot just by you talking about, you know, what the police do, what the social says, because we don't know. You know, in schools we don't know because no one tells us. So
I'm really keen to get that out there. And I think what frustrates me is, and I'm due to leave the police. I'm due to retire because I'm that old, but I'm obviously going to continue in what I'm doing. But I think one of the frustrations I get is, when you work for a big organisation, it's very much that's not your role.
Yeah.
You know, so to give an example, I offered just before I retired to go out and do area training. So go around all the police stations and just give officers a refresher and interviewing. And I was told that's not my role, but I was sitting there saying, but I'm a trainer. How can that not be my role? You know, and I think people will soak up anything you give them. You know, I mean, I'm currently doing my diploma in ABE interviewing. Now, I've done ABE interviewing for 20 odd years, but I've learned so much just doing my diploma, you know, because I've learned little ideas, little things that I never thought about before, that I've thought, oh, actually, that's a good way of doing it. I'll kind of take that on board. So I think you can learn, you know, listening to podcasts. That's why I was keen to do this. I think you can learn things just by listening to someone talking.
Just by listening.
Yeah, just by listening to what someone does in their day-to-day job, you know, just getting a better understanding. And I think what I found was, I thought I understood social workers' roles quite well, having worked with them for 20 years. And I've got a lot of good friends that are social workers. But I think when I went and done my master's, I suddenly understood it so much better, because I then understood the lack of backup that they have with powers and procedures, you know, and I was kind of like, God, I didn't realize that. You know, I thought social workers could just do that. So again, you know, you never stop learning. I don't think, no matter how long you've been going for.
Yeah. No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Okay.
Now, I do have a question for you, because we do that thing where we ask somebody a question and then the person, you have to answer the ones before.
Yeah.
Now, this case is that most of the people working in schools, they've asked very school-based questions. So I've got a question that I want to know, if that's okay, from you, and then you can give your question to the next person. So my question to you is about, how does the police handle safeguarding concerns involving children with SEND needs who have limited communication or are non-verbal? How are they able to then gain the child's voice or opinions or attitudes? How do they go about that?
Okay. I wish I'd known this, because I could have shown you my box. So child protection officers are very much encouraged to keep boxes now. So we have boxes that have visual aids in them now, which are kind of agreed by intermediaries and educational psychologists. So that can be used in an initial visit. We also encourage them to think about things like, and this isn't so much non-verbal, but not fidget toys, not noisy fidget toys, but things that can kind of just, because again, like we say, them in with vulnerable adults, if they've got something that they can play with, it's going to settle them. But going back to the aids, so with the aids, we have visual aids that, like, we've got worry monsters and worry people, where it gives you all the different feelings. So we might turn around and say to them, how are you feeling at the moment? And it allows them to point to it. We've got body maps to allow them to point to certain areas of the body if they feel that they can't say it or they don't know how to say it. So we train officers to do that initially, because I think in the joint visit, that's really important, just to get that initial joint visit done. That might not always work. So what we look at is, we then look at registered intermediaries. So that would be our go-to, really. So we would apply to the Ministry of Justice for what's called a registered intermediary. Registered intermediaries are organised by the Ministry of Justice, and they usually have some sort of background in speech therapy or some sort of learning needs. So you then get matched up to the intermediary that suits the job that you're asking for. So if you had a child who was non-verbal, we would get someone who specialises in non-verbal communication. They would then come in with the officer and then work through that case right through to court. And what happens then is if it does get to court, that intermediary is with them throughout the way. They're an independent, so they're not the police, they're not for the defendant, they are purely a court process, which I think gives families a lot of, especially when you're dealing with something that is within the family, it gives them a lot of reassurance that that person that's coming in and communicating for their child isn't working for the police. You know, we're not working it. So, but yeah, unfortunately, that would probably be the way. You know, we try to train officers as much as we can to use aids. And I know in interviews, we quite often will use timelines if the child can do a timeline, but post-it note timelines where they can visualize it. So we're getting much better at looking at how we visualize things for children. So we use a lot of drawings. We get them to write a lot of things down. If a child can't see a certain body part because they're embarrassed, say, we will get them to kind of write it down, and then we will say it once and then we won't repeat it. But we'll say, right, that's what we're going to refer to. We may add a number to it or something like that. We have things like just simple things like take a break buttons. So we have a picture that's of a take a break button, and we say to them, press that at any time you want a break. Because again, you're being interviewed by the police. It's an alien process. You feel quite under pressure. You're not going to sit there and say, can I have a tea break? You know what I mean? But what you might do is actually say, you know, press the button and kind of go, I need a break. I think also that helps the officers, because I think sometimes officers get tunnel vision and they just go with what they need to get. So sometimes if they can look at something on the table as well, it makes them think, actually, we've been talking for 20 minutes, let's take a break. So, you know, the visual aids we use are not just there to help the people communicate, but they're actually there to kind of remind the officers to communicate better. So we're not brilliant at it. It's a very new thing. And it's a very, you know, people have to be very comfortable with it. And like I say to officers, you only get comfortable with it by using it. But, you know, I know officers now that carry little kits that have got feeling fans in them. So, you know, it fans out and it's got a happy face, a sad face, you know, and they'll say, how did you feel when that happened? And they'll get them to point. You know, I know they've got body maps in there so that they can sit and draw with the children. So they are starting to think, right, how can we get that communication going without the verbal things? We also try to teach them things about, so we do a bit of child development. Because again, police officers in initial training have no child development training. So they're going out and speaking to children having no knowledge of how a child develops. So we do a bit about that. But what we also try to teach them is that sometimes children, especially with learning difficulties, so that's why we do that day on autism and learning difficulties, they might look like they're processing something, but they're either not processing it or they're struggling. You know, so it's getting them to think about how can I make that easier for them to have time to take it in. And that might just be giving them time. You know, asking them a question and then saying, I'm going to give you a minute to think about that. And I always say to officers, get comfortable with being uncomfortable. You know, because you will be, when you're sitting there and you're waiting in a answer from a child, you will feel uncomfortable because you'll kind of be waiting on that response. And is it going to come? And that silence can be quite awkward. So, and rapport is a big thing as well. So, you know, make sure that you do that rapport when you go in. And if that child can't communicate normally, speak to the teacher and find out how you can communicate with them. Because that child needs to know you as a human being, not just as I say a uniform, but as a suit, you know, because we don't wear uniform. But that child needs to kind of, I don't say self-disclose, but you need to give something to that child. You know, you need that child to know that you're actually human. So whether that's like, oh, I've got a dog called Bertie as well, or I've got 2 cats, you know what I mean? Just something that you're quite happy to disclose. It's just that little bit personal to that child. But yeah, so it's a tough one. And like I said, the box that we've got, I would have shown you, it's got loads of stuff in it. You know, and officers can add to it as they go along. So quite often, if they have an intermediary meeting, they'll pick something up from the intermediary and they'll go, oh, I like that. Or they'll pick something up from a social worker. You know, or even a teacher. You know, a teacher might say, oh, this is the system we use in the classroom. So they'll pick that up. So I always say to them, be open to kind of taking other things on. But yeah, so that tends to be what we use at the moment.
Right, thank you. Now, do you have a question for our next guest at all?
I do,
Yeah.
and I had to really think about this because it's always difficult to. But I guess my question would be what their thoughts are on the proposal for mandatory reporting for safeguarding that the government are currently looking at. And I probably say that because myself, I'm really for it. I just don't know
Yeah.
how we're going to manage it.
Yeah.
And that's my big
good.
thing. I'm really for it, but how do we as professionals do that? How are we going to adhere to that? So yeah, that would probably be my next question. So the person that's got the next question is probably going to hate me.
Well, that's a very good question because it is a lot. It's a hot topic at the moment. It's a
Yeah, and I
very
think
hot topic.
especially in schools, I think, again, it's going to be
Yeah.
frontline, isn't it? It's going to be
Yeah.
the frontline thing for schools, unfortunately.
I like that question a
Oh,
lot.
oh, that's good
Ooh.
because it took me a while to come up with it. I was like, I really need to come up with something decent, so I was really racking my brains.
No,
Um,
that's great. No, that's
but
very
yeah,
good. I like it. That's great.
yes.
Thank
So
you.
no, it's okay. I'm sorry if I've spoke too long. I do tend to go on a
No,
bit about it, but
well, I've learned lots today, and I'm sure that our listeners would have learned
yeah,
lots.
I mean, I really
Yeah,
do hope it be helpful because I think the more
yeah, I think
barriers we
so.
break down and the more we kind of get people understanding each other's roles, I think we can't go far wrong with that,
I
really.
agree. I agree. So thank you very much for your
No,
time, and
thank
good
you.
luck in retirement. I hope you have a
Thank
lovely
you.
time.
Thanks very
Uh,
much.
thank you very much. Thank you. Hi, thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you could all do me a favour and just click that subscribe button, that would be great. Thanks, bye.